أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is Amin Iswedi, and you're listening to the Murid Talks podcast. My fellow aspirants, after a long break, I welcome you once again to another solo episode of the Murid Talks podcast. In the last episode, we talked about the concept of the meme as related to motherhood and water, both being a manifestation of the all-encompassing womb, Rahm, which is God's mercy through which all life emerges. We saw how, from the waters, the Noon, as represented by Noah and Yonah, emerge, reborn into the life of the Spirit, revivified. It is so interesting to observe also that just as the fetus is encompassed by the mother's womb, it is also within that womb encompassed by the waters of the amniotic fluid, and from the waters of its parents it was conceived. It is a beauty that this symbol can be observed at multiple domains of reality, ultimately pointing us to the ultimate. God says that He will show us signs in ourselves and in the universe, literally the horizons, until we know He is the truth. All are symbols, ayat, which literally means verses, which are to be read and through them realize the truth in all. In continuation to the symbolism of water and by its extension life, today I'd love to touch upon the story of John, Yahya, son of Zachariah. The story from the Quranic standpoint actually starts with motherhood. In Quran 3:35, when God tells us of the prayer of Imran's wife, vowing to give out her child for God's service. And we know that ultimately this child is Mary, the epitome of the meme, the mother, the bearer of fruits. Again here, fruits being a symbol not only of offspring, but also of spiritual gifts revealed from the divine. We see a literal manifestation of fruits though in Quran 3:37, when Zachariah asks Mary how she gets all the fruits she has in her room whenever Zachariah visits. Mary, in a saintly fashion, replies that it is from Allah. Indeed, Allah provides for whom He wills without account. As a man of great spiritual insight, Zachariah sees through the symbol and realizes the symbolized. God as the provider. All that is provided comes from the divine. It is ultimately a manifestation from Him. God is, after all, Zahir, the manifest. Zachariah, from this realization, prays to be granted a good offspring. But the interesting thing is how he says his prayer. He doesn't say, "Grant me a good offspring," which is perfectly okay as a prayer, but rather says, "Grant me from yourself a good offspring." The distinction here is the word yourself. I believe this comes from great spiritual insight as to the workings of reality and going back to the idea that all is God's manifestation. All is from God, not only as some byproduct, but from their very reality, their very essence. God then tells us in Quran 3:39 how, in a state of vigilance and prayer, a ritual that denotes spiritual concentration and communication with higher states of reality, Zachariah is called by angels, who, from a metaphysical standpoint, represent the higher states of being, as well as the universal principles that govern reality as attributes of the supreme principle. From this communication, Zachariah is given glad tidings of John by name. John is also prophesied to be a confirmer of God's word, which in this case could be that of God's revelation in general, or if we are to refer to the Christian tradition, Jesus in particular. But I also believe this to mean that he, John himself, through his birth, would be a confirmation of God's word, the word being that by which all things are manifested, but also God's promise or word to Zechariah. God's will is unchallenged. All he says comes to pass. John is also prophesied to be honorable. The Arabic word used is Sayyid, which is used in a similar fashion to honorable as a title, so honorable president, honorable minister. But in the Islamic tradition, it is used mostly with great personalities such as prophets, their companions, and saints. But it is also a title used in initiatic Sufi circles, tariqas, amongst the aspirants, but also ultimately with a Sufi master. So more on that later. John is also prophesied to be an abstinent, vowed to chastity, and a prophet. These prophecies are extremely significant if we are to understand John's significance in the grand unfolding of reality. The story goes on by Zechariah being astonished by the news, asking how he and his wife will have a child whilst they've attained old age. Also a very significant detail. This leads me to believe that there was a passage of a significant period between his initial prayer to have a good offspring and the calling of the angels with John's news. The angels replied to Zechariah, saying, "That is Allah. He does what he wills." Again, this somehow echoes what Mary answered to Zechariah when he asked about the fruits. Zechariah asks for a sign, and he is told that he won't be able to speak in 3 days except through gestures, but also that he should be in a state of dhikr, remembrance, and exaltation of the divine. This idea of silence and constant remembrance and exaltation is of great significance to the concept of spiritual retreat from which one emerges reborn, or, in another way of expression, bearing the fruits of the divine. God tells us in Quran 19:7 that John's name was the first of its kind, that no one was given that name before him. And in Quran 19 verses 8 to 9, after Zechariah asks how they will have a child in old age, God answers by saying, "It is easy for me, for I created you before, while you were nothing." So it's very interesting here that the Quran repeats Zechariah's question in 2 different verses, but the answers are different. In the first one, the angels tell Zechariah that is Allah, he does what he wills. But in this iteration, God says himself that it is easy for me, for I created you before, while you were nothing. This is very, very important. So it is important for us to reiterate these fine details as it helps us unpack and attain insight from the life of John. To begin unpacking, let us explore what John's name means both in the original Hebrew and in Arabic. In Hebrew, John is identified as Yohanan, which is a shortened form of Yahohanan, which means he who is kind, compassionate, loving. Al-Hanan is also a name of God in Islam. So from this, John's very name is built by 2 of God's names, Yahu and Hanan, from an outer level identifying God's kindness to Zechariah. As God gave fruits to Mary, he bestows John as a fruit to and of Zechariah. But I also see in this name, Yahohanan, the complementary aspects of the divine. Yahu being the unspoken name, the hidden, the ineffable, the transcendent, the silent, as represented by the Hebrew Tetragrammaton. And Hanan being a manifestation, an emanation, an outpouring of God's love, kindness and compassion, mercy, which, if we are to connect with the previous episodes, are the very foundations of life, the very foundation of reality. Mercy is that through which God gives life. As God says in the Quran, my mercy encompasses all things. This connects us with the second meaning of John's name viewed from the Arabic perspective, Yahya, which is connected with the word Hayy, which means alive, living. Once again, John is connected to the concept of life through his name and his coming to being. So, at once, John is a representation of creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothingness. And because nothingness isn't an ontological reality to create from, we are to understand by it creation from nothing but God's self. Taking us back to Zechariah's prayer, grant me from yourself a good offspring. Life is nothing but a manifestation of God himself. It has no reality of itself. It doesn't exist apart from God. It is from God, of God, by God, with God, in God. John is also an example of an ascetic, as prophesied by him being an abstinent. We see in him an example of one who has left the worldly pleasures behind for the sake of the divine. Abstinence, like silence or fasting, requires great resolve to tame and transform one's soul to attain divine consciousness, taqwa. Through his spiritual practice, John attains the level of spiritual master, Sayyid, and he is greatly known in the Christian tradition as the Baptist. Baptism, from an esoteric level, signifies one's initiation into the divine mysteries. The first step of being reborn into the life of the Spirit. It is interesting that this ritual involves water as a symbol of life. Again, from the mim of the water comes the nun, that is the initiate. We know from Matthew 3 verses 13 to 17 that Jesus walks to John to be baptized, but realizing his spiritual potential, John remarks that it is he who should be baptized by Jesus. But Jesus, through wisdom, realizes the significance of the spiritual master and the process of initiation. We see then how after the baptism, that which was potential in Jesus is actualized by the opening of the heavens and the descension of the Spirit of God. This highlights the significance of initiation in the spiritual path and a spiritual master who, through the process, helps one realize and actualize one's spiritual potential. The master is akin to the mother who births, initiates, and nurtures the child into the new life. It is also significant to note how John brought new life at a time when his parents had attained old age. Again here, John symbolizes a new age, a new cycle, the renewal of life, the inheritor of Zechariah's prophetic mission. As Ibn Arabi says in his Fusus al-Hikam, Zechariah's memory was to live through John, which is inherent in the very name, Yahya, he will live. To conclude, we see in John an example of one devoted to spiritual and ascetic practice, which entail his devotion to the divine, and through it, his attainment of high spiritual status. John assumes the role of the sheikh, the spiritual master and initiator, and through the ritual of baptism brings the seekers into the new life of the Spirit. This teaches us of the importance of the spiritual master, one through whom we attain knowledge and discipline to ultimately realize the divine. The master is there to guide us through the process of tazkiyah, purification, also symbolized by John's use of water to purify the initiates, and from this purification to open our intellects to receive divine light. I pray that God grants us the presence of spiritual masters who will baptize us in the revivifying waters of the divine, so as to realize our spiritual potential and be reborn into the new life. May His word live through us like that of John, the symbol of life, renewal, sainthood, and spiritual aptitude. Until next time, my friends, I bid you farewell. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.